Support for this podcast comes from the law firm of Davis Malm. Whether you're a developer, property owner, manager, or commercial tenant, their real estate attorneys know the lay of the land, not just the law. Learn more at davismalm.com.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. WBUR senior climate and environment reporter Miriam Wasser. Welcome back to The Common.
Thanks for having me back.
Oh, yeah. So, Miriam, you have a story about offshore wind energy and whether the industry is booming or busting. So it's a little confusing. So you're trying to bring some clarity to that. But before we get into the story, can you just explain to us what exactly is offshore wind energy and what role does it play in Massachusetts' energy future?
Absolutely. So an offshore wind project is a renewable energy project that is out in the ocean, and it takes advantage of strong and consistent winds to spin turbine blades, which generate electricity, and that gets sent to the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that it is so critical to states like Massachusetts, and actually states all up and down the East Coast, I would say, is twofold. One, we have really ambitious climate and clean energy goals, and offshore wind is crucial to that because, the number 2 point, we don't have a ton of other options. We don't have a bunch of open space like Texas or Iowa to build huge onshore wind farms or big solar farms. What we have is offshore wind. We also have people located at the coastline who would take advantage of that. And so states like Massachusetts have put a lot of emphasis on offshore wind. It also it provides a lot of economic opportunities. So we're talking about creating thousands of new jobs, potentially new manufacturing centers, revitalizing old port cities like New Bedford or New London. So it is just a backbone component of our clean energy and sort of economic plans, I'd say.
Tell me about the offshore wind projects that are underway in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so there's one big project, Vineyard Wind. It is located about 15 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, and it is currently under construction. So this week, they're finishing up some of the first turbines. And the goal is to start generating electricity for the grid by the end of the year. And people that I talk to say you really cannot understate how big of a deal this is. This is the first large-scale project in the country, and it's not inevitable that we got to this point. This project faced a ton of challenges under the Trump administration. And then even just prior to that, we had a failed experiment with offshore wind here in Massachusetts. We tried to build a project called Cape Wind in the 2010s that didn't work out. And, you know, the United States is really far behind on offshore wind. There are a lot of countries in Europe that have hundreds of turbines. There are some Asian countries that have a lot of offshore wind. And so I think part of the significance of Vineyard Wind is that it is proof of concept that we can do this in the United States.
Okay, so you have this one project that's going up, Vineyard Wind, but you mentioned some other projects that failed and the fact that the U.S. is behind on offshore wind energy. Why is that? What are the challenges to building more offshore wind energy facilities?
These are huge projects that cost billions of dollars to build. And a lot of them were proposed at a time when the economy looked really good and things were really strong. And so developers felt optimistic about bidding low prices, right? Saying like, we can build this and we can deliver cheap electricity for really low prices. And states were like, yes, please, let's do this. And they signed contracts for these projects. And these are long 20-year contracts. And then the economy started to fall apart. Interest rates started to rise. We had inflation. We had a lot of post-COVID supply chain issues that were like still ongoing. Russia invaded Ukraine and sent a lot of the energy markets into a frenzy. And that just created this like cascading effect of rising costs for developers. So, you know, if you have a project that costs like $3 billion, a 0.5% rise in interest rate can raise the cost of your project by a tremendous amount. And so you had all of these developers who were suddenly on the line to deliver these massive projects really cheap, who are looking at their financials and saying, like, we can't do this anymore. And pretty much exactly a year ago, one developer that had proposed a project here in Massachusetts was the first to stand up and say, we can't do it at this price. We need to renegotiate this contract. This project was called Commonwealth Wind, and it was a pretty big project. Shortly thereafter, developers from other projects also said, like, hey, we're struggling too. And this is not just unique to Massachusetts. There are projects struggling in New York, in New Jersey, all over the place. And different states have dealt with this in different ways. But here in Massachusetts, what we ended up doing is allowing the Commonwealth Wind project and then another big project that was in the pipeline called South Coast Wind. We allowed the developers to basically sever their contracts. And they have promised to still build these projects, but they're just going to rebid them in the future and probably at a higher cost.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back with more from Miriam Wasser. What kind of implications does this situation have for wind energy in the state down the line?
Yeah, it probably means that it's going to be more expensive. In Massachusetts in particular, when we select wind projects, in the past, the biggest factor has been price. So we chose projects that were going to deliver really cheap electricity. That's probably not going to be the case in the future. Will it be more expensive than fossil fuel prices? I don't know. Fossil fuel prices change all the time. So it's hard to predict like long-term what's going to happen, but it may not produce the same cost savings that were originally projected.
So what does this uncertainty mean? Are people just going to give up on offshore wind, or who's trying to figure out a way forward right now?
Yeah, so that was one of the big questions I had when I set out to report this story is like, what are people on the inside saying? Are people optimistic that this is just kind of like a hiccup, or do they think that this like might be the end of offshore wind? And one of the people that I talked to for this story is Senator Mike Barrett, who heads up the state's Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Commission. So he's like really in the weeds of all this stuff. And he said he's actually pretty optimistic about the industry.
To my mind, we're engaged in the standard experience of pulling off very ambitious new building exercises.
So that's a pretty optimistic outlook on the situation. But what are the stakes if officials in Massachusetts don't figure out a way to move forward with offshore wind?
The stakes are incredibly high. If offshore wind doesn't happen, we're in a lot of trouble. So, states like Massachusetts are trying to do what they can. Several states have appealed to the federal government for help. Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act this year, which is this big climate bill, and there's a lot of tax credits in there. And there's some uncertainty about, whether these big projects qualify for certain tax credits. It's kind of like deep in the weeds, but this could be millions and billions of extra dollars for these projects. So this is a huge deal, right? So the states are saying like, Treasury Department, you need to figure out how to get these companies to qualify for these tax credits because they need them. And then some big news that we just got last week, Governor Maura Healey announced a new partnership with Connecticut and Rhode Island. So all three states have upcoming auctions for new projects, and we're going to coordinate. So we're going to allow developers to bid really big multi-state projects. And this should help them take advantage of economies of scale, help make supply chain coordination easier. It will help make permitting possibly faster. And the goal is to help bring down prices because we know the projects that are going to come in the future are going to be more expensive than the ones we've had before.
So through all of that, Miriam, what exactly will you be keeping an eye on in the future?
I think what's really interesting to me is this upcoming auction. Rhode Island recently held an auction and they got one bid and the state rejected it because the price was too high. So who knows what could happen? We could get a ton of bids that are really great. We could get one bid that's like, meh. I think the state is hoping that this sort of multi-state approach will be really attractive to developers and help reduce risks. I've heard from some developers who think this is a great idea too. And in the meantime, other parts of the country are pursuing offshore wind too. So there are some lease areas that were just auctioned off in the Gulf of Mexico. That did not go as well as people had hoped. The West Coast is pursuing offshore wind. There are plans to build some offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, and that'll use a new technology. These would be floating turbines as opposed to ones that are pounded into the ocean floor. We're building manufacturing centers up and down the East Coast. I don't want to say a cliche, but so much is up in the air and so much is riding on these next couple of months. I was surprised in a way at how optimistic people seem to be and seem to feel like these massive challenges that we're facing right now, we're going to get through it and we're going to build offshore wind because, as some people said, we don't really have another option. We have to do this. So I'll be watching all of those things.
Understood. Well, Miriam, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming through to The Common to talk to us about this.
Anytime, Daryl.
That's WBUR Senior Climate and Environment Reporter Miriam Wasser. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. As always, folks, if you like what you're hearing, please go to wherever you listen to podcasts, especially Apple or Spotify. Rate and review us. Let us know how you're liking the show. If you've already done it, thank you so very much. We really, really appreciate it. It helps us out a lot. If you want to get in touch with us, hit us up on Instagram at WBUR The Common or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I will talk to you tomorrow.